Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV patch rundown video. Today we'll be breaking down the latest patch 12.7, and don't worry, we're being serious this time. It's important to note this patch will be used for the Worlds Tournament. The significance of that is we don't expect meta-breaking adjustments. Instead, think of this as a follow-up to the 12.6b patch to help smooth out any balancing issues and hopefully promote a diverse meta. We'll be covering the meta-relevant changes, so let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. There's no major system changes to go over, so let's jump right in with the augment changes. Before we get into the specific adjustments, there's quite a few augments being removed or having limitations placed upon them. The few being removed are Hextech Unity, Hextech Crest, Scholar Crest, and Woodland Trinket. Honestly, none of these being removed will be noticeable, and it sets a precedent that they'll be willing to take out pointless augments outside of major milestones like releasing a new set or the mid set. As for limiting when certain augments can appear, great! These restrictions further push augments towards a healthier place, especially since they'll be sticking around in the next set. Most of the augments being restricted just don't scale well in the late game. For example, an econ augment like Rich Get Richer is clearly better on 1-4 and provides far less value later on, so now it only appears on that round. On the other side of the coin, a combat augment like Featherweight is specifically tailored towards low-cost champions, meaning it generally only gets value early game, so it will no longer appear on 4-6. Or an augment like Verdant Veil that does very little in the early game but can be impactful later on, meaning it won't show up on 1-4 anymore. There are a lot of these limitations, and we recommend reading through the patch notes to see all of them, but be assured that these are good changes for the game and the augment system as a whole. Now for actual balance adjustments, beginning with Double Trouble. This augment has been quite troublesome for balance, so they're toning down all the bonus stats it provides. Overall, this mainly affects reroll compositions, which may further push the meta towards late game comps. The scaling added to Electro Charge was a good step in bringing this augment back into the meta, but that didn't quite hit the mark. To spark it back to life, each tier is getting slightly more scaling. That said, it is still mostly an early game augment, so expect to see the most results in stage 2 and 3. An extremely interesting change is moving 4 score from gold to silver. Of course, that does mean they're dropping it from 4 champions to 3, but still, being in silver means it's more likely to show up on average. Even though it seems like a nerf, this should help 4 score be picked up more often since it was competing with a lot of strong augments in the gold tier. Similarly, High 5 is going from prismatic down to gold tier with the same tweak to lowering the number of champions by 1. This may be far more of an impactful change because prismatic augments are extremely competitive and High 5 wasn't always playable. In gold tier though, it's easily one of the best options, especially if the meta continues to be focused on the late game. Junkyard was one of the augments receiving a restriction, but the more important change is increasing the number of rounds before a component appears from 3 to 4. Will Junkyard still be worth picking up? More than likely, yes, because it's only pickable on 1-4, so you will always get the maximum amount of value from it. That said, it does make it slightly less appealing and may go down a bit in priority. A minor change is to Pirates as they've bumped up the chance from gaining gold on kill from 50% to 66%. A 66% chance is pretty high, but the circumstances where a player has this augment choice and has mercenaries is pretty low. It is definitely far more appealing, so if you do pick it, enjoy the increased loot. Generally, when an augment shifts tiers, it can be impactful, but not too much of a massive change. But Sharpshooter going up to Prismatic tier is massive because it reduces the availability by a lot. Before, it wasn't too uncommon to see Sharpshooter taken every few games, but now it's even less likely, and in turn, it means twin shot boards will be weaker on average. Honestly, it is a good change, but it is without a doubt a nerf. Surprisingly, they're nerfing the heck out of Triforce, with each tier being reduced by 10%. That's a hefty nerf for a somewhat niche augment, especially given the meta shift towards the late game. Sorry, Tryndamere fans, if you thought there was a chance he'd be back in the carry seat, it looks like it's trait bot duty again. Yordle enthusiasts will be sad to see both So Small and Thieving Rascals nerfed this patch, but let's be honest, those augments needed it. Not so much because Yordles are way overpowered, but those two augments were far too powerful in the right situation. Windfall is once again receiving a buff with a significant boost when taken on 4-6. The problem still remains that it's just an econ augment and thus takes the back seat to a combat augment and utility augments beyond the early game. Still, 55 gold is a lot and may finally push Windfall to being pickable more often. And our final augment change is to Built Different. Built Different is just a tad bit too powerful, specifically in the early game since it's such a huge boost in stats. Thus, it's nerfing time. More so towards the higher tiers of it than tier 1, though player sentiment does point towards built different 1 as being more of a problem. In any case, it'll be weaker, and only seasoned players who are truly built differently will be able to effectively use this augment. After a bunch of augment adjustments, the trait changes are far fewer to talk about. Up first is Scholar. Scholar is generally a splash trait, meaning players rarely ever use more than 2 Scholar champions in their comp. In an effort to make Scholar more appealing beyond that, they're buffing 4 and 6 Scholar to 12-25 mana gained from 10-20. That's an okay boost, though it's unlikely we'll see many 6 Scholar boards. It's hard to say if this change will have any relevant impact on the meta since, as we said, Scholar is almost always a splash synergy and never the focus. Furthering the vendetta against Twin Shot, they're nerfing the upper end of the synergy by reducing the attack damage down to 40-70 from 45-80. Mixed with this, the Sharpshooter now being prismatic should mean Twin Shot takes a step back in the meta. That said, having so many viable carries means Twin Shot should at least remain relevant in the mid game. It's just going to be weaker as a late game board with all these nerfs. The last trait change is to Yordle. The 6 Yordle trait is not too shabby, but seeing as they're taking away the power in the Yordle augment, they want to add it back to the trait itself. So now 6 Yordles will have 30% mana reduction, up from 25%. While their intentions are clear, the actual buff itself is pretty minuscule, and more than likely we'll see even less 6 Yordles in the meta than before. And that's okay, Yordle should really just be seen as an early game synergy instead of trying to force it into late game relevance. Alright, with that we can move into our last section, champion changes. There's not too many champions being changed in this patch, as the 12.6b patch covered a lot of the meta problems, but there are still a few outlier champions that need to be adjusted. First, the only one-cost champion adjustment is a very minor buff for Caitlyn, as her max mana is going down to 100 from 110. While it's not a massive change, it does make Caitlyn an even better early game champion. Apparently, Ashe had a bug with her mana that they've now fixed. Somehow that bug meant that they were able to buff her ability to have 10% more AD scaling, so yay for Ashe! Having 110% AD scaling is definitely a decent buff, and we may see Ashe return to the meta, at least in the early game as an item holder. Reroll Ashe is still unlikely to be a viable option. Twin Shot is nerfed even more as Corki is going from 190 to 315 damage on his ability down to 180 to 290. Arguably this may be because of the 6 Yordle buff, but let's be real, Corki was mainly used with Twin Shot and Arcanist. This nerf directly affects both traits and just means we're less likely to see Corki as a carry. Talon is still struggling to remain relevant, so naturally that means it's time for a nerf. It's a minor change as Talon is only losing 5 magic resist and armor, but the squishier he is, the less damage Talon will do. At this point, we can safely say Talon reroll is not worth it the majority of the time, which means Talon is being relegated to trait bot status. We mentioned Tryndamere early with the Triforce nerf, but never fear, Tryndamere fans, they are buffing his ability. Spinning splash damage goes up to 70, 90, 110 from 50, 75, 100. Not too shabby of a buff, though let's be honest, the spinning damage of Tryndamere's ability is not what holds him back from being a relevant carry. Sadly, all the issues Tryndamere have are still present, so don't expect too much from him in the 12.7 meta. Super small buff to Cho'Gath as his health goes up by 50. Nothing amazing, still overall a weak unit. Senna, on the other hand, is getting a much more relevant adjustment as her ability's base damage is going up to 100, 140, 200 from 80, 120, 180. Is that enough of an increase for us to see the return of Senna carry? Well, no, probably not, especially since one of the best ways to run Senna carry was with Triforce, which was nerfed. But Senna is already a relevant champion in the meta, and this buff just furthers that, plus now she's a decent item holder in the mid game. Buff after buff, and yet Draven continues to be sitting on the struggle bus. But no more shall Draven be inconsistent. At least that's the goal, as they're buffing the base damage of his ability. Maybe with this buff and nerfs to other champions, Draven will finally be a consistent carry in the meta. Innovators always somehow remain relevant in every meta, though they were having problems scaling towards the late game. To assist with that, they're buffing Seraphine by lowering her mana to 130 from 150. Seraphine carry is probably unlikely, but having her cast earlier and more often is definitely a buff. It's funny how nerfs warp the perception of a champion. Initially in the 12.6b patch, Sivir disappeared from the meta entirely. Not even a week later, she was suddenly back at being one of the best 4-cost units. That means it's time for another round of everyone's favorite minigame, Sivir nerfs. First off, the damage scaling of her bounce attack is going down to 30% from 40%. In addition to that, the bonus attack speed is going from 50-70% to 45-65%. Either one of those nerfs was probably enough, and both are probably going to push Sivir down below a lot of the other carries in the meta. But as we've seen, Sivir seems quite resilient to nerfs, so we won't be too surprised if she remains relevant. Ahri's orbs gain a small boost in damage, hopefully to add a bit of consistency for her. Overall, Ahri is doing just fine in the meta, so a buff probably wasn't necessary. They are readjusting Jin's mana to 60 max from 50. Seems as though he's doing just a bit too well with the mana changes they've made before, so it's going back to the regular old Jin in 12.7. Time now for the 5-cost champions to round out today's balance patch. Victor's up first with a max mana increase of 5. 5 is not a huge number, but generally translates to 1 extra auto attack before hitting max mana to cast. This may actually matter for Arcanist boards in the late game, as sometimes it really does come down to 1 Victor spellcast. Try as they might to buff him, Galio just never quite hits the same mark as he did back in the glory days of Clapio. But they are trying, as Galio's entrance damage is going from 8% max health to 10%. Sure, it's a buff, but a far chicken's cry from the golden days of old Galio. The last champion adjustment is to Zeri with an increase to her base attack speed from 0.8 to 0.9. Keep in mind that attack speed has a crazy good scaling the higher base amount on a champion, so 0.9 is a fairly significant amount to have. Will that make much of a difference? Well, sort of. The attack speed basically means Zeri will get to her ultimate faster, and that's always useful whether she's a VIP or not. In reality, Zeri was doing well in the late game with items and when upgraded. This buff makes her better, yes, but that's still dependent upon being 2-starred to do well as a damage dealer. That's all for today's video, folks. As usual, the bulk of the meta changes are to augments because they continue to be the hardest to balance each patch. Overall, 12.7 looks to be a well-balanced patch, so that hopefully diversifies the meta. Let us know in the comment section below which change you're the most excited to test out. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.